By the early 5th century BCE, Rome replaced hereditary kingship with an untested system of shared authority, one that deliberately fragmented power to prevent any single individual from ruling alone. The traditional Roman chronology places the fall of the monarchy in 509 BCE, marked by the expulsion of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Rome's final king. Ancient literary sources, most notably Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, describe Tarquinius as a ruler whose consolidation of authority violated earlier norms of elite consultation. While these accounts were written centuries later and shaped by Republican ideology, they consistently frame the monarchy's end as a response to perceived tyranny rather than a sudden popular revolution. Archaeological evidence from the late 6th century BCE, including changes in elite burial practices and monumental construction patterns in the Roman Forum, supports the conclusion that Rome underwent a significant political restructuring during this period. Following the removal of the king, Rome did not abolish centralized authority entirely but redistributed it across multiple offices. Executive power was transferred to 2 annually elected magistrates, later known as consuls. These officials held imperium, the authority to command armies and preside over civic administration, but their power was deliberately limited by short terms and collegiality. Each consul possessed the ability to veto the actions of the other, creating an internal check within the highest office of the state. Records indicate that this system was designed to prevent the reemergence of monarchical dominance while preserving effective leadership during war and crisis. The Senate emerged as the central advisory institution within this new political framework. Composed primarily of aristocratic elders drawn from leading families, the Senate did not possess formal legislative authority in the early republic. However, its control over finances, foreign policy guidance, and long-term strategic planning granted it substantial influence. Archaeologists uncovered early meeting spaces near the Comitium, indicating the Senate's institutional continuity from the late regal period into the Republic. Rather than representing a democratic assembly, the Senate functioned as a stabilizing body that preserved elite consensus and institutional memory. Political participation among the broader population was mediated through popular assemblies, which retained roots in earlier tribal and military groupings. The Centuriate Assembly, organized by wealth and military obligation, elected senior magistrates and voted on matters of war. This structure ensured that political influence remained weighted toward property-owning citizens. Voting procedures reconstructed from later legal texts indicate that poorer citizens participated symbolically but rarely determined outcomes. As a result, the early republic functioned as an oligarchic system in which elite competition occurred within a regulated institutional framework. Legal uncertainty remained a persistent issue during the republic's first decades. Judicial authority was initially exercised by magistrates who relied on customary law interpreted through aristocratic precedent. This arrangement generated tension between patricians and plebeians, particularly as legal decisions lacked transparency. According to later Roman tradition, sustained pressure from non-elite citizens led to the creation of the 12 Tables around 450 BCE. These laws were publicly displayed, likely in the Forum, and represented Rome's first attempt to codify legal norms. The 12 Tables addressed matters ranging from property rights and debt enforcement to family law and legal procedure. Although the original bronze tablets have not survived, their content is partially preserved through quotations in later authors such as Cicero and Gaius. The laws did not establish equality in a modern sense, but they standardized procedures and limited arbitrary interpretation. Archaeological context from mid-5th century Rome, including increased urban organization and public construction, aligns with a broader pattern of institutional formalization during this period. Religious authority also underwent adjustment after the monarchy's fall. The king's sacral functions were redistributed to priestly offices, including the Rex Sacrorum and the Pontifical College. This separation of religious ritual from political command ensured that sacred authority could no longer legitimize unilateral rule. Inscriptions and ritual calendars preserved by later Roman scholars indicate that religious continuity was maintained while executive power was curtailed. By the mid-5th century BCE, the core institutions of the Roman Republic were in place. Annually elected magistrates, an advisory senate, popular assemblies structured by wealth and military obligation, and a codified legal framework. These mechanisms did not eliminate inequality or conflict, but they established predictable procedures for governance. The republic that emerged was neither static nor fully coherent, but it represented a deliberate departure from hereditary rule toward a system defined by rotation of office and shared authority. Before continuing, viewers who wish to follow this series can subscribe to the channel and enable notifications for future Nightfall history documentaries. Engagement through comments also supports the continued production of long-form, research-driven historical content. Political stability in Rome emerged not from harmony, but from managed conflict. During the early centuries of the Republic, Rome's political system was shaped by a prolonged struggle between two broad social groups: the patricians, who monopolized senior magistracies and religious offices, and the plebeians, who constituted the majority of the citizen population but initially lacked formal political protection. Ancient sources refer to this period as the conflict of the orders, a series of negotiations, confrontations, and institutional reforms spanning roughly from the early 5th to the mid-4th century BCE. Rather than a single uprising, this conflict unfolded through repeated crises that forced adjustments within the republican framework. According to later Roman historians such as Livy, the first major confrontation occurred around 494 BCE, when plebeian citizens withdrew from the city in what tradition describes as a secessio plebis. Although the details of this event are difficult to verify archaeologically, records indicate that the outcome was the formal recognition of new magistrates, the tribunes of the plebs. These officials were tasked with protecting plebeian citizens from abuses by magistrates holding imperium. Their authority rested on the principle of sacrosanctitas, which made interference with their office a religious violation. This innovation marked a significant institutional development within the Republic. The tribunate introduced a new form of political power that operated alongside, rather than within, the existing magistracies. Tribunes possessed the right of auxilium, allowing them to intervene on behalf of citizens, and later acquired the power of veto, intercessio, over official actions. Records indicate that this authority was initially limited to the city of Rome, reflecting the urban context of early republican politics. Over time, however, the tribunate became a central mechanism through which plebeian interests could be articulated within the political system. Alongside the tribunate, the plebeians developed their own assembly, the concilium plebis. This body, organized by tribal divisions rather than wealth classes, passed resolutions known as plebiscita. At first, these decisions applied only to plebeians, but their increasing political weight reflected the growing institutional coherence of plebeian organization. Later legal tradition records that these assemblies operated independently of the Senate, signaling an important shift in how authority could be exercised within the Republic. Despite these developments, political inequality persisted throughout much of the 5th century BCE. Patricians continued to dominate senior offices, including the consulship, and controlled access to religious knowledge that governed legal interpretation. The publication of the 12 Tables around 450 BCE partially addressed these concerns by making legal procedures visible and standardized. However, the laws did not eliminate class distinctions, nor did they dismantle aristocratic dominance. Instead, they provided a procedural framework within which disputes could be contested more predictably. Economic pressures further intensified social tensions. Archaeological and literary evidence suggests that small landholders faced increasing vulnerability due to debt, military service obligations, and periodic food shortages. Debt bondage, nexum, referenced in later legal discussions, became a focal point of plebeian grievance. Although the precise scale of the practice remains debated, its repeated appearance in reform narratives indicates that economic dependency played a significant role in shaping political demands. The most substantial structural reforms emerged in the 4th century BCE, culminating in the Licinian Section Laws of 367 BCE. According to Livy, these measures addressed three central issues: limitations on public landholdings, debt relief provisions, and access to the consulship. One of the laws required that at least one of the two consuls be a plebeian, effectively opening the highest magistracy to a broader segment of the citizen elite. This reform marked a turning point in the formal integration of plebeians into the Republic's governing institutions. Following these changes, plebeians gradually gained access to other magistracies and priesthoods, including the praetorship and major religious colleges. Inscriptions and later administrative records indicate increasing overlap between patrician and plebeian elites, suggesting that political competition shifted from strictly hereditary divisions toward rivalry within a broader aristocracy. The Senate itself expanded to include families of plebeian origin, reinforcing institutional continuity while altering its social composition. The resolution of the conflict of the orders did not eliminate inequality or factionalism, but it established mechanisms through which disputes could be managed within the political system. Authority remained concentrated among a relatively small elite, yet the republic gained durability by incorporating new participants into its framework. These reforms strengthened the legitimacy of republican governance while embedding structured competition into its institutions. The republic relied as much on cultural norms as on written law. Beyond its formal institutions, the Roman Republic was sustained by a shared system of values that shaped political behavior, social expectations, and elite competition. These values were not codified in statutes but transmitted through tradition, education, and public example. Romans referred to this inherited moral framework as mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. It defined acceptable conduct in public life and established standards against which individual actions were judged. In the absence of a centralized constitution, mos maiorum functioned as an informal regulatory system that guided governance and constrained ambition. At the center of this value system was the expectation of civic duty. Roman citizens, particularly those of the elite, were expected to serve the state through military command, magistracies, and participation in public assemblies. Records indicate that political authority was inseparable from service. Holding office was framed not as a personal entitlement but as an obligation to the community. This expectation reinforced participation in republican institutions and discouraged prolonged withdrawal from public life. Archaeological evidence from early republican Rome, including honorific inscriptions and public monuments, reflects the importance of visible service to civic identity. Elite behavior was further shaped by interconnected concepts such as virtus, dignitas, and gloria. Virtus referred to excellence demonstrated through action, particularly in military contexts. It was not an abstract moral quality but one proven through achievement. Military success enhanced a citizen's standing and provided the foundation for political advancement. Literary sources, including later Roman historians, consistently link battlefield distinction with eligibility for higher office, suggesting that military command remained a primary pathway to authority throughout the Republic. Dignitas represented accumulated prestige derived from past service, ancestral achievement, and public reputation. Unlike virtus, which could be earned through a single act, dignitas was cumulative and fragile. It required constant reinforcement through visible participation in civic life. Magistracies, public speeches, and legal advocacy all contributed to maintaining this standing. The competitive nature of dignitas encouraged continuous engagement with republican institutions, as withdrawal risked loss of influence relative to rivals. Gloria, closely related, referred to public recognition and remembrance. It extended beyond the individual to the family lineage, reinforcing aristocratic continuity across generations. Funerary practices, including public processions and ancestral masks described by later writers such as Polybius, served to display accumulated gloria and reinforce elite identity. These rituals embedded political competition within a historical narrative, linking present officeholders to an idealized republican past. This value system promoted stability by aligning personal ambition with public service. Competition among elites was not discouraged. Rather, it was structured through institutional channels. Elections, military commands, and legal contests provided regulated arenas for rivalry. As long as participants respected shared norms, competition reinforced institutional legitimacy. Archaeologists uncovered early republican public spaces designed to accommodate assemblies and legal proceedings, indicating the centrality of visible, ritualized political engagement. However, the same values that stabilized early Rome also embedded long-term tensions within the system. The emphasis on competitive achievement meant that political life was inherently adversarial. Success was relative rather than absolute, measured against peers rather than fixed standards. As Rome expanded and opportunities for distinction multiplied, these values intensified rivalry rather than limiting it. Military conquest, in particular, amplified disparities in prestige and resources among elites. The transmission of republican values relied heavily on education and example rather than enforcement. Young aristocrats were socialized through participation in campaigns, legal apprenticeships, and attendance at public proceedings. This informal system reinforced continuity but depended on consensus among elites. When consensus weakened, cultural norms alone proved insufficient to restrain ambition. Records from later periods indicate increasing disputes over precedent and interpretation, suggesting that mos maiorum was adaptable but not immutable. Religion also played a role in reinforcing civic identity. Religious offices were closely linked to political authority, and ritual observance was understood as a public responsibility. Omens, festivals, and vows connected military success to divine favor, reinforcing the moral framework of service and discipline. Inscriptions and priestly calendars preserved in later sources demonstrate how ritual practice intersected with governance, embedding political action within a sacred context. By the 4th century BCE, republican values had produced a political culture characterized by participation, competition, and continuity. These norms supported institutional resilience during periods of social negotiation and reform. At the same time, they fostered a form of ambition that required constant expansion of opportunity. As Rome's influence extended beyond Italy, the scale of competition increased, placing growing strain on the cultural foundations of the Republic. Rome expanded by incorporating enemies rather than erasing them. Following the consolidation of internal institutions, the Republic directed its attention to the Italian peninsula. By the 4th century BCE, Rome faced neighboring Latin, Etruscan, and Samnite communities that maintained distinct political identities and military capabilities. Rather than pursuing outright annihilation, Rome employed a strategy of flexible incorporation, combining military conquest with negotiated alliances. These arrangements allowed defeated or neighboring communities to retain local governance while contributing soldiers to the Roman war effort, thereby creating a cohesive yet multilayered political network. Records from Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus describe treaties that conferred partial or full citizenship on allied communities, often contingent on military service. These agreements, formalized through laws and decrees, extended civic obligations without immediately granting political equality in central decision-making. Archaeological evidence, including Latin inscriptions on boundary markers and dedications from allied towns, confirms that these arrangements were widespread. Military levies drawn from allied populations significantly increased Rome's manpower, allowing it to wage protracted campaigns against more organized opponents. Military integration reinforced political cohesion. Citizen soldiers were organized into legions that combined Roman and allied contingents, promoting interdependence and mutual accountability. The Comitia Centuriata, the assembly responsible for electing senior magistrates and approving war measures, reflected the Republic's evolving military demographic balance. Historical records suggest that the contribution of allied forces allowed Rome to maintain sustained campaigns without overextending local citizen soldiers, embedding cooperation within the Republic's institutional framework. Infrastructure development supported this integration. Archaeological studies indicate that roads, such as early segments of the Via Latina and Via Appia, were constructed to facilitate troop movement, supply chains, and communication between Rome and its allies. Colonies were strategically established along conquered or allied territories, functioning as garrisons and administrative centers. Excavations at sites like Callus and Venusia reveal layouts consistent with both military and civic functions, demonstrating how Rome combined settlement planning with territorial control. Socially and politically, the extension of partial citizenship created a layered hierarchy of rights and responsibilities. Latin allies, socii, were obliged to provide troops and adhere to Roman military command, while retaining local legal authority. Over time, this system facilitated the integration of diverse communities into the Republic's legal and cultural orbit. Records indicate that individuals from allied towns could, in certain circumstances, migrate to Rome, participate in civic life, or attain magistracies, creating incentives for loyalty and assimilation. The process of unification also strengthened Rome's capacity for sustained warfare. By incorporating defeated communities into the military framework rather than suppressing them entirely, the Republic built an extensive pool of trained soldiers. This approach allowed Rome to conduct simultaneous campaigns across multiple fronts, first against remaining Italic groups and later against external powers. Literary accounts highlight successive conflicts with Samnites, Equi, and Volsci, demonstrating that victory required both martial prowess and the ability to coordinate allied contributions. Legal codification and standardized administration underpinned this system. Treaties were often documented and publicly displayed, ensuring that obligations and privileges were transparent. Epigraphic evidence confirms that municipal charters granted defined rights, including local governance, tax obligations, and military duties. These measures maintained order and reinforced the perception of reciprocal obligation, reducing the likelihood of rebellion among newly integrated populations. Economic integration accompanied military and political unification. Rome encouraged allied communities to contribute resources, including agricultural surplus and materials for infrastructure. Road construction and colony establishment facilitated trade, while military mobilization created demand for goods and labor. Archaeological evidence from market spaces and storage facilities indicates that Allied regions were increasingly linked to Rome's economic networks, solidifying political dependence through material interconnection. By the conclusion of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had achieved dominance over the Italian peninsula. The Republic's strategy of incorporating enemies into its civic and military framework proved effective in consolidating power without provoking large-scale insurgencies. The integration of Allied forces and the extension of selective citizenship not only enhanced Rome's military capabilities but also established a durable precedent for the management of conquered peoples. Victory over Carthage reshaped Rome's destiny. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Rome had consolidated control over the Italian peninsula and faced the prospect of confronting Carthage, a maritime power dominating Western Mediterranean trade. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, arose from competition over Sicily, with both states seeking strategic advantage. Rome, previously a land-based power, adapted to naval warfare through the construction of a fleet modeled on Carthaginian designs. Contemporary sources, including Polybius, describe innovations such as the corvus, a boarding device that allowed Roman soldiers to leverage their strength in infantry combat at sea. Archaeological evidence, including remnants of naval shipyards at Ostia and accounts of harbor facilities, corroborates Rome's rapid adaptation to maritime conflict. The First Punic War concluded with Rome's victory, establishing its presence in Sicily as the first Roman province outside the Italian mainland. The acquisition of Sicily brought substantial revenues through taxation and tribute, setting a precedent for the administration of overseas territories. Roman control of Sicily also exposed the Republic to the logistical and political challenges of governing distant populations, including integration of local elites and management of resources for ongoing military needs. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, represented a far more severe challenge to Rome's strategic capacity. Hannibal Barca's invasion of Italy, crossing the Alps with elephants, introduced a sustained military threat that directly tested the Republic's resilience. Sources such as Livy and Polybius document Hannibal's victories at Trebia, 218 BCE, Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE, and Cannae, 216 BCE, which resulted in the temporary collapse of Roman field armies and widespread panic among allies. Archaeological evidence, including battlefield remains and fortified settlements, supports the scale and intensity of these campaigns. Despite these setbacks, Rome maintained cohesion through a combination of political organization, loyalty from remaining allies, and the mobilization of replacement legions. Rome's strategic response to Hannibal relied on both direct military engagement and broader operational control. Quintus Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator in 217 BCE, implemented a strategy of attrition and avoidance, minimizing direct confrontation while harassing Carthaginian supply lines. This cautious approach, documented in Roman annals, allowed Rome to preserve manpower and adapt to the unconventional tactics employed by Hannibal. Simultaneously, Rome leveraged its capacity to raise successive armies from both citizens and allied communities, demonstrating the structural advantage of its integrated military system. The eventual Roman counteroffensive under Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus culminated in the invasion of North Africa and the decisive Battle of Zama, 202 BCE. Polybius describes Scipio's tactical innovations, including manipulations of infantry formations to neutralize Carthaginian elephants and coordination of combined arms. Victory at Zama effectively ended Carthaginian resistance on the Italian and African fronts, consolidating Roman control over the western Mediterranean. The resulting treaty imposed significant indemnities on Carthage, territorial concessions in Spain, and limitations on its military capacity. The strategic consequences of the Punic Wars extended far beyond immediate military victory. Rome's overseas holdings expanded rapidly, introducing substantial wealth, human resources, and governance responsibilities. Conquered territories supplied tribute, agricultural surplus, and slaves, which were incorporated into the Roman economy. Archaeological evidence from urban centers in Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain demonstrates the integration of provincial infrastructure, including roads, fortifications, and administrative installations, aligning local economies with Roman demands. Socially, the wars accelerated internal transformations within the Republic. Returning veterans often found their small farms neglected or destroyed, increasing urban migration and economic stratification. The concentration of wealth among elites who controlled contracts, spoils, and trade networks amplified class tensions. Literary accounts indicate that this redistribution of resources contributed to the emergence of powerful individuals whose influence increasingly extended beyond traditional magistracies. Politically, the expansion of Roman territory challenged the capacity of republican institutions. Magistracies, originally designed for localized administration, faced unprecedented demands for coordination, oversight, and fiscal management across diverse provinces. The Senate assumed increasing authority in directing strategy, finances, and diplomatic relations, highlighting both the adaptability and strain of the republican framework. Simultaneously, the inclusion of provincial elites into limited civic roles reflected Rome's pragmatic approach to governance while maintaining overall control. By the conclusion of the Second Punic War, Rome had established itself as a dominant Mediterranean power. The experience of prolonged overseas campaigns demonstrated the Republic's capacity for sustained military mobilization, strategic planning, and administrative flexibility. The victories over Carthage provided unprecedented opportunities for economic accumulation and territorial expansion, laying the foundation for a new phase of imperial projection. Empire brought prosperity, but unevenly. The territorial expansion resulting from the Punic Wars generated unprecedented wealth for Rome, yet its distribution amplified social and economic disparities. Conquered lands supplied not only tribute payments and resources but also labor in the form of captives and enslaved populations. Literary sources, including Polybius, emphasized that large-scale warfare supplied a steady influx of slaves, whose labor underpinned the operations of elite estates and urban households. Archaeological studies of rural villas and latifundia across central Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia reveal extensive agricultural complexes designed for high-volume production, often maintained through enslaved labor. These estates increasingly concentrated land in the hands of wealthy aristocrats, while smallholders struggled to compete economically. The growth of latifundia, large estates specializing in grain, olives, and vineyards, transformed both rural and urban landscapes. Excavations at sites such as the Latium coast and Campanian plains demonstrate systematic exploitation of these estates, including storage facilities, irrigation channels, and road connections facilitating transport to urban markets. These developments highlight the scale of economic integration across provincial territories and the reliance on organized labor networks. Literary commentary from Roman authors notes that displaced small farmers frequently migrated to Rome or other urban centers, creating a class of landless citizens increasingly dependent on patronage and grain distributions. Provincial administration became a critical mechanism for extracting resources and managing Rome's new territories. Provinces were governed by magistrates assigned imperium, responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and supervising public works. Inscriptions, including dedicatory texts and tax records preserved from Sicily and Hispania, illustrate structured hierarchies of administration and oversight. Governors often relied on local elites to implement taxation and legal obligations, blending Roman authority with pre-existing civic structures. While this system enhanced efficiency, it also created opportunities for corruption, particularly as provincial governors accumulated personal wealth through exploitation, tribute manipulation, and control of markets. The economic consequences of these processes were unevenly felt across Roman society. Wealth and resources increasingly concentrated among senators and equestrians, who benefited directly from contracts, trade, and access to enslaved labor. The resulting disparity intensified competition within the elite, as individuals sought prestige, political influence, and accumulation of property. At the same time, ordinary citizens, especially those displaced from rural holdings, experienced declining economic security. Contemporary accounts note that urban populations swelled, with grain doles and other forms of public assistance partially mitigating social tension. Archaeological evidence from urban settlements shows expanded infrastructure for storage, trade, and housing, reflecting the integration of new social strata into city life. Slavery itself became a defining feature of Roman economic and military capacity. The capture and redistribution of prisoners of war from Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain supplied both agricultural labor and urban domestic service. Literary accounts describe both skilled and unskilled labor systems, with enslaved workers deployed in mines, workshops, and farms. The reliance on enslaved labor allowed elite families to consolidate wealth, reduce reliance on citizen labor, and increase profitability of provincial estates. At the same time, the scale of slavery introduced social tensions in both rural and urban contexts, particularly where mass revolts occurred, as later historical accounts of slave uprisings illustrate. Provincial integration also shaped political and military priorities. Magistrates governing provinces required substantial resources to maintain order, including garrisons, roads, and fortifications. Archaeological remnants of military roads, such as the Via Aemilia, and fortified settlements demonstrate the systematic control of territory to secure both resource extraction and strategic advantage. The administrative structure emphasized revenue collection and military readiness, reflecting Rome's dual objectives of profit and security. By the end of this period, Rome's expansion had created a highly stratified economic system. Prosperity existed, but it was heavily concentrated among the elite, while smallholders and urban populations faced increasing vulnerability. The integration of provincial wealth and labor, combined with elite concentration of land and resources, contributed to long-term structural pressures on the Republic. Rome soldiers returned to find their land gone. The expansion of Rome's territories following the Punic Wars brought unprecedented wealth, yet it also precipitated profound social and economic disruption within the Italian heartland. Veteran soldiers who had served for years in distant campaigns often returned to find their small family farms neglected, sold, or absorbed into large estates controlled by wealthy aristocrats. Literary sources, including Polybius and later accounts in Livy, describe the displacement of rural populations as a consequence of both the latifundia system and debt accumulation. Land concentration intensified over the 2nd century BCE, with elite families consolidating plots into large-scale estates worked primarily by enslaved labor. Archaeological evidence from central Italian plains, including patterns of abandoned small farms and expansion of villa complexes, corroborates these developments. The economic consequences of this land displacement were severe. Smallholders, previously the backbone of the citizen soldier class, faced declining incomes and limited opportunities for productive labor. With rural livelihoods undermined, many migrated to Rome and other urban centers, seeking employment, patronage, or relief. The influx of displaced citizens contributed to overcrowding in urban neighborhoods, where housing was often rudimentary and public infrastructure strained. Excavations of early Republican urban settlements revealed densely packed dwellings and expanded market areas, suggesting a rapid demographic shift from rural to urban populations. Debt also compounded the agrarian crisis. The system of nexum, in which debtors could be bound into servitude until obligations were fulfilled, persisted into the mid-2nd century BCE. While later Roman legal reforms gradually mitigated the most extreme forms of bondage, contemporary records indicate that debt remained a source of tension between the elite and landless citizens. Many smallholders, unable to meet fiscal obligations due to lost agricultural income, faced legal and social vulnerability. In combination with land loss, this financial strain contributed to the growth of an urban underclass dependent on elite patronage or public distributions. Urbanization and land displacement also altered the composition of Rome's citizen-soldier class. The traditional linkage between property ownership and military service meant that many new urban dwellers were ineligible for army enrollment. This threatened the Republic's manpower base and forced magistrates and Senate authorities to consider alternative recruitment policies. Inscriptions and military records from the period suggest that adjustments in levy requirements and the reliance on allied troops partially compensated for the reduction in citizen farmer participation. Nevertheless, the structural strain on military recruitment reflected the broader social consequences of agrarian consolidation. The concentration of wealth and land created both political and economic incentives for reform. Elite families, benefiting from latifundia and provincial exploitation, increasingly competed for prestige and influence through accumulation of property, while displaced citizens sought redress through the assemblies and tribunate. Archaeological evidence, including early colonial settlements and estate expansions, illustrates that material gains from conquest reinforced social hierarchies and widened the gap between elites and ordinary citizens. Literary accounts repeatedly link these inequalities to growing political tension and the eventual emergence of reformist initiatives. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome faced a dual challenge: a class of landless citizens concentrated in urban areas and a political elite whose interests were increasingly aligned with wealth accumulation rather than civic balance. The resulting demographic and economic pressures undermined the Republic's traditional equilibrium, creating conditions for the emergence of legislative interventions designed to address land distribution, military eligibility, and social cohesion. Reform efforts emerged from this crisis. For the first time, political disagreement ended in bloodshed. By 133 BCE, Rome's social and economic strains had reached a critical point. The concentration of land in the hands of wealthy elites, the displacement of citizen farmers, and the growing urban poor had created widespread pressure for reform. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, elected tribune of the plebs in that year, proposed legislation aimed at redistributing public land, ager publicus, to restore smallholders. His proposals, framed as a continuation of earlier agrarian laws, sought to enforce limits on the size of estates and redistribute surplus land to impoverished citizens. Literary sources, particularly Plutarch and Appian, emphasized that these reforms were unprecedented in both ambition and direct challenge to the entrenched patrician elite. Tiberius utilized the tribunician office to bypass traditional senatorial control. Unlike consular magistrates, the tribune possessed veto power over senatorial decrees affecting plebeians. Tiberius's innovative interpretation of the tribunate extended this authority to block senatorial opposition, effectively challenging the customary hierarchy of Roman governance. Records indicate that he convened the concilium plebis to pass his agrarian law, circumventing the Senate entirely. This procedural deviation marked a significant rupture in republican norms, highlighting the tension between established institutional channels and popular political mobilization. The Agrarian Commission, authorized to implement the law, faced resistance from landholding elites who had benefited from decades of accumulation. Tiberius attempted to enforce compliance through legal and administrative measures, including appointing commissioners and allocating funds to support land distribution. Inscriptions and later historical accounts suggest that implementation was uneven, provoking opposition from the Senate, equestrian class, and conservative patricians. The resulting friction escalated beyond debate, exposing the Republic's vulnerability to personal and factional confrontation. Tiberius's political maneuvers culminated in a confrontation with the Senate that ultimately turned violent. Contemporary and later sources recount that, in October 133 BCE, a group of senators and their allies attacked Tiberius and his supporters during a public assembly, resulting in his death and that of several followers. This act, unprecedented in the Republican period, demonstrated that political disputes could now manifest in lethal force rather than procedural negotiation. Archaeological evidence for the events is limited, but literary accounts consistently emphasize the constitutional shock it created. The assassination of Tiberius Gracchus represented more than the death of a reformer. It signaled the erosion of normative restraints within the Republic. Whereas magistrates had traditionally pursued policy through institutional channels, the resort to violence established a precedent for resolving political disagreements extralegally. Subsequent debates among historians underscore that this moment destabilized the balance of power between popular assemblies and the Senate, creating an environment in which ambition and factional rivalry increasingly dictated political outcomes. Tiberius's death also had social consequences. The urban poor and dispossessed farmers, whose grievances the tribune had sought to address, were left without legal recourse. The failure to implement land reforms effectively, combined with the visible assertion of elite dominance through violence, intensified dissatisfaction among plebeians. Literary records note a growing willingness among subsequent political actors to leverage mass mobilization, both to assert authority and to counter opposition, reflecting a shift in the Republic's political culture toward confrontation rather than negotiation. Furthermore, Tiberius's use of the tribunate highlighted institutional ambiguities. While the office was designed to protect plebeian interests, it had no formal mechanism to enforce laws against entrenched elites. The ability of a tribune to bypass or override traditional checks became a source of tension, revealing structural weaknesses in the constitutional design of the early republic. These ambiguities would recur in later crises, demonstrating that systemic limitations rather than individual personalities often drove instability. By establishing a precedent for political violence, the events of 133 BCE marked a turning point in Roman history. The assassination of Tiberius Gracchus normalized lethal intervention as a tool for achieving political ends, undermining the expectation that disputes could be resolved through institutional channels alone. Violence normalized political conflict. Reform expanded the Republic's reach, but fractured its unity. A decade after his brother Tiberius's death, Gaius Sempronius Gracchus assumed the tribunate in 123 BCE, inheriting both the opportunity for reform and the memory of violent precedent. The political environment had evolved. Urban populations had grown, landlessness remained widespread, and elite competition had intensified. Gaius implemented a broader legislative agenda than Tiberius, combining agrarian reform with measures designed to restructure the Republic's administrative and judicial institutions. Literary sources, particularly Plutarch and Appian, describe these reforms as ambitious attempts to strengthen central authority, integrate the equestrian class into governance, and stabilize social relations, while also provoking unprecedented factional tension. Central to Gaius's program was the expansion of administrative oversight through equestrian involvement. He empowered the equestrian order to adjudicate provincial financial disputes and tax collection, creating a semi-independent judicial apparatus outside the Senate's control. Inscriptions and contemporary accounts confirm the establishment of these courts, which monitored governors' exploitation of provinces and adjudicated complaints from allied communities. By diverting power from senatorial oversight, Gaius enhanced accountability and increased the Republic's reach into provincial administration, but simultaneously antagonized the traditional aristocracy, whose authority was thereby diminished. Gaius also implemented policies to address urban food security. The grain law, lex fermentaria, provided subsidized grain to Rome's citizen population, institutionalizing support for the urban poor. Archaeological studies of granaries and transport infrastructure indicate the logistical complexity of these distributions, reflecting both administrative sophistication and dependency on state mechanisms. By connecting political loyalty with material provision, Gaius reinforced the alignment of urban populations with reformist policies, thereby expanding the political base for plebeian influence within the Republic. Reform extended to electoral procedures and office holding. Gaius sought to make the tribunician and other magistracies more accessible to non-senatorial candidates, reinforcing the principle that power could be exercised outside traditional patrician channels. Literary records suggest that these measures generated resentment among established elites, who viewed such changes as a challenge to hierarchical norms. The combination of judicial reform, grain subsidies, and expansion of office access intensified competition within the Republic, creating a polarized political environment in which loyalty to factions outweighed institutional consensus. The response of the Senate and conservative elements was immediate and forceful. Gaius's opponents leveraged both legal and extralegal strategies, portraying reformist measures as threats to elite prerogatives. Sources indicate repeated confrontations in the Forum, demonstrations by urban citizens, and violent clashes between rival political groups. Unlike the assassination of Tiberius, Gaius faced sustained organized opposition that combined legislative obstruction, mob intervention, and military enforcement. His eventual death in 121 BCE, during clashes orchestrated by senatorial-aligned forces, underscores the lethal stakes of Republican factionalism and the breakdown of institutional arbitration. The Gracchan reforms reveal the structural vulnerabilities of the Republic. The combination of expanded administrative authority, public welfare programs, and judicial innovation enhanced the state's capacity to manage social and economic challenges but simultaneously disrupted established elite hierarchies. Literary evidence suggests that these policies created enduring divisions between conservative senatorial factions and reformist or populist elements, institutionalizing conflict within the political system. Administrative control over provinces and urban populations became a source of factional leverage rather than a neutral mechanism of governance. Moreover, Gaius's reforms demonstrate the entrenchment of factionalism as a systemic feature of the late Republic. Political competition increasingly relied on mobilization of popular support, urban assemblies, and personal networks, rather than consensus building through traditional Senate deliberation. The alignment of specific social groups with legislative initiatives transformed the political landscape, embedding ideological and economic divisions into the functioning of Republican institutions. Archaeological evidence of urban crowd management, fortifications, and public meeting spaces suggests that the physical and social infrastructure of Rome adapted to these new patterns of contention. By the conclusion of Gaius Gracchus's tribunate, the Republic had been transformed institutionally and socially. Reforms expanded Rome's administrative and social capacity, yet the resulting polarization undermined the legitimacy of collective governance. Elite competition, previously mediated through offices and assemblies, now relied increasingly on mobilized constituencies and the threat or use of violence. Military power increasingly replaced civil consensus. The army became a career, not a duty. By 107 BCE, the Roman Republic faced persistent military challenges on multiple fronts, including the Jugurthine War in Numidia and increasing pressure from migratory tribes along the northern borders. Traditional recruitment, reliant on property-owning citizens serving as part-time soldiers, was no longer sufficient to sustain prolonged campaigns. Gaius Marius, elected consul in that year, implemented a series of reforms that fundamentally altered the structure, composition, and loyalty of the Roman army. Contemporary sources, including Sallust and later accounts in Plutarch, describe these changes as both a practical response to manpower shortages and a systemic transformation with lasting political consequences. Marius's reforms opened recruitment to landless citizens, capitancy, who had previously been excluded from military service due to property qualifications. This shift expanded the pool of potential soldiers, allowing Rome to field larger, more sustainable legions. Unlike traditional citizen soldiers, these recruits often lacked independent landholdings and relied entirely on military service for their livelihood. Soldiers were provided with standardized equipment at the state's expense and enrolled in longer terms of service, creating a professionalized army capable of extended campaigns and sustained operational readiness. Archaeological evidence, including camp layouts and weapon distributions, supports the emergence of a permanent, standardized military infrastructure during this period. The professionalization of the army also produced a crucial shift in loyalty. Whereas previous citizen soldiers were motivated primarily by civic duty, land ownership, and temporary obligations, Marian recruits increasingly depended on their generals for pay, provision, and future land allotments. Historical sources indicate that this dependency fostered personal allegiance to commanding officers rather than the Senate or traditional republican institutions. Soldiers' prospects for wealth, land, and social advancement became closely tied to the success and favor of their generals, creating a new dimension of political leverage that individual commanders could exploit. Organizationally, Marius restructured the legion into cohorts, standardizing both unit size and command hierarchy. Training regimens became more rigorous, emphasizing discipline, maneuverability, and adaptability in diverse theaters of operation. Military manuals and later commentary from Roman authors highlight the introduction of systematic drill, integrated equipment, and coordinated battlefield tactics, enhancing operational efficiency. These reforms enabled Rome to conduct simultaneous campaigns over multiple regions, from Africa to Gaul, while maintaining centralized strategic control through professional officers. The reforms also had administrative consequences. Generals were tasked with recruitment, training, and supply, consolidating authority over both personnel and logistical networks. Provincial governors increasingly relied on loyal legions for enforcement of policy, protection of territories, and suppression of unrest. Inscriptions and epigraphic records from the late 2nd century BCE document veteran settlements, coloni, granted by generals in recognition of service, illustrating the direct link between military career and personal reward. This practice reinforced the dependence of soldiers on commanders, creating a durable shift in power dynamics within the Republic. While the Marian reforms strengthened Rome's military capacity, they also introduced systemic risks to Republican governance. The alignment of professional armies with individual generals created opportunities for political intervention by military leaders. The Senate's traditional control over consular assignments and provincial commands was gradually undermined, as popular assemblies and military loyalty allowed generals to pursue independent agendas. Literary evidence from subsequent decades shows that generals increasingly leveraged their legions to influence elections, legislation, and policy, establishing a precedent for the political use of armed force. Socially, the reforms addressed immediate pressures among landless citizens by providing employment, income, and potential settlement through veteran colonies. However, they also contributed to the erosion of civic norms that had linked military service to landholding and communal responsibility. The traditional citizen soldier, tied to local agrarian interests and civic duty, was supplanted by a professional cohort whose identity and loyalty were defined by the army and its commanders rather than by civic institutions. By the end of Marius's reforms, the Roman army had been transformed into a professional, career-oriented force capable of sustained campaigns across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Republic's military effectiveness increased substantially, enabling rapid responses to external threats and facilitating expansion, but the shift in loyalty toward generals created enduring implications for political authority. Military loyalty altered political authority. Roman legions now faced Rome itself. The Marian reforms, by professionalizing the army and linking soldiers' loyalty to their generals, created conditions for unprecedented political-military confrontation. The Social War, 91 to 88 BCE, fought between Rome and its Italian allies, intensified these structural pressures. Italian communities, long subjected to tribute, conscription, and limited political representation, revolted to demand full citizenship. Literary sources, including Appian and Plutarch, describe the scale of the conflict, with legions deployed both to suppress insurgents and to maintain control over Rome's internal order. The war demonstrated the Republic's dependence on professional armies and the political leverage generals could exert through military command. Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, prominent commanders during this period, exemplified the intersection of military and political power. Marius, repeatedly elected consul and a hero of earlier campaigns, commanded significant popular support among the urban and landless classes. Sulla, a patrician aligned with conservative senatorial interests, controlled legions drawn from Italian allies and Roman citizens alike. The rivalry between these figures highlighted the Republic's vulnerability. Both could mobilize disciplined armies with personal loyalty that rivaled, and at times exceeded, allegiance to civic institutions. In 88 BCE, the conflict escalated when Sulla was assigned command against King Mithridates of Pontus. Marius's political faction, contesting the Senate's decision, attempted to transfer the command to itself, prompting Sulla to take the extraordinary step of marching his legions on Rome. This marked the first time in the Republic's history that a Roman general brought a professional army into the city to assert political objectives. Ancient sources describe the occupation as methodical. Sulla secured key gates, controlled assemblies, and forced compliance with his orders, demonstrating that military might could override traditional republican processes. Archaeological evidence of fortifications and urban military presence supports the plausibility of such maneuvers, reflecting the practical challenges of defending the city against professional troops. Sulla's precedent undermined long-standing constitutional norms. The principle that military service was tied to the defense of the Republic was replaced by a system in which generals could wield armed force to achieve political ends. The loyalty of soldiers to commanders rather than the state created an environment in which factional disputes could be resolved through coercion rather than institutional debate. Subsequent accounts emphasize that Sulla's actions blurred the distinction between external and internal threats, demonstrating the latent potential for civil conflict embedded within the Marian army structure. The social war itself exacerbated these tensions. Italian allies, seeking citizenship rights, challenged Rome's legal and military frameworks. Generals leading campaigns against insurgent allies were granted extraordinary imperium, which extended their authority beyond ordinary consular limits. Inscriptions and contemporary records indicate that these commands allowed commanders to levy troops, allocate resources, and negotiate settlements, reinforcing the connection between military control and political authority. This structural expansion of command capacity created additional opportunities for ambitious generals to leverage troops for domestic influence. Sulla's subsequent proscriptions and reorganization of the Republic's administrative structures following his return from the East further demonstrated the political consequences of personal armies. While these measures were framed as restorations of constitutional order, they relied heavily on the presence of loyal legions and reinforced the notion that political authority could be maintained or enforced through military dominance. Literary sources indicate that senators and magistrates who opposed Sulla's reforms were executed, exiled, or stripped of office, illustrating the capacity of professionalized armies to enforce political agendas and redefine civic norms. The actions of Marius and Sulla collectively established a durable civil precedent. The use of armies to influence elections, override magistrates, and occupy Rome itself demonstrated that republican institutions were no longer sufficient to constrain generals' ambitions. This precedent shaped subsequent conflicts, including the confrontations between Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, where the integration of personal armies into political strategy became routine. Archaeological evidence of veteran settlements and urban military infrastructure indicates that these practices left lasting material and demographic footprints on the city and the Italian peninsula. By the conclusion of these events, the Republic faced a transformed political landscape. Generals possessed professional armies loyal to their command, citizen assemblies and the Senate had diminished capacity to enforce policy independently, and civil confrontation through force was normalized. Dictatorship emerged as a solution. Reform imposed by force proved unsustainable. Following his unprecedented march on Rome, Lucius Cornelius Sulla assumed extraordinary powers as dictator in 82 BCE, tasked with restoring stability to a republic fractured by civil war. Sulla's approach combined legal restructuring, administrative reform, and violent repression to consolidate senatorial authority and curtail populist influence. Historical sources, including Plutarch, Appian, and Dio, describe his tenure as both an assertive assertion of elite power and a demonstration of the Republic's structural vulnerability. The events of Sulla's dictatorship reveal the limitations of institutional reform when enforced through military dominance rather than collective consensus. Central to Sulla's consolidation was the use of proscriptions. Lists of political enemies were publicly published, permitting confiscation of property and execution without trial. Literary accounts estimate that hundreds of senators, equestrians, and other prominent citizens were killed, with estates redistributed to loyal supporters and veterans. Archaeological evidence of redistributed estates and urban property allocations supports the extensive economic impact of these measures. By eliminating political opposition and rewarding loyalty, Sulla sought to reinforce senatorial dominance and create a buffer of personal allies whose fortunes were tied directly to his authority. Sulla also implemented constitutional reforms aimed at strengthening the Senate and limiting the power of the tribunate. He increased the number of senators, reinforced senatorial oversight over magistracies, and curtailed the ability of tribunes to introduce legislation or obstruct policies. These measures reflected a deliberate effort to restore traditional hierarchies disrupted during the Gracchine period and the subsequent civil conflicts. In theory, these reforms reinforced republican structures. In practice, their implementation relied entirely on the coercive authority of his personal armies. Inscriptions and legal records from this period indicate that legislative decrees were enacted under duress, with compliance enforced through intimidation and violence. Despite Sulla's intentions, the dictatorship exposed the fragility of constitutional mechanisms when separated from popular and institutional legitimacy. Reforms designed to empower the Senate were effective only while Sulla maintained military control. Once he voluntarily resigned in 79 BCE and retired from office, the Republic quickly reverted to factionalized politics. Subsequent conflicts, including the rise of Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, demonstrate that the structural dependence on personal armies had become entrenched, rendering Sulla's senatorial restoration ephemeral. Literary commentary emphasizes that the precedent of using military force to impose reform had been firmly established, weakening traditional civic norms. Economic and social effects of Sulla's dictatorship further illustrate the unsustainability of reform by force. The redistribution of wealth and property to veterans and loyalists temporarily stabilized elite factions but exacerbated inequalities and resentment among those excluded from political favor. Urban populations, still reliant on grain distributions and political patronage, found themselves caught between competing factions. Archaeological studies of veteran colonies in Italy and Sicily show that settlements were strategically placed to consolidate military influence, linking land allocation directly to political allegiance. Sulla's reliance on personal loyalty over institutional compliance revealed a fundamental weakness in the late Republic. Authority had become inseparable from control of armed forces. Even with constitutional reforms, enforcement depended on the continued presence and allegiance of loyal legions. The Senate's restored powers lacked intrinsic force without military backing, illustrating the failure of traditional republican mechanisms to constrain ambitious generals. Inscriptions documenting provincial governance further confirm that governors' authority increasingly depended on their own armies rather than abstract civic structures. By the end of Sulla's dictatorship, the Republic had experienced both temporary stabilization and long-term structural degradation. While senatorial authority was reinforced for a brief period, the broader pattern of political life now relied on personal alliances, military loyalty, and coercion. The use of proscriptions and forceful legislation demonstrated that constitutional reform alone could not restore equilibrium in a system where personal armies dominated political leverage. Power increasingly relied on personal alliances. Prestige eclipsed procedure. In the decades following Sulla's dictatorship, Rome's political landscape continued to evolve under the pressures of professional armies, wealth accumulation, and factional rivalry. By the late 1st century BCE, prominent figures such as Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus exemplified the increasing influence of personal prestige and extraordinary commands over constitutional norms. Both men leveraged prior military achievements and financial resources to bypass traditional republican procedures, demonstrating that informal authority often outweighed legal constraints in determining political outcomes. Pompey, renowned for his campaigns against pirates in the Mediterranean and the Sertorian insurgency in Spain, received extraordinary imperium from the Senate and the popular assemblies. This extended his command beyond standard annual consular terms, granting him autonomous military authority across multiple provinces. Literary accounts from Plutarch emphasize that Pompey's imperium was legally exceptional, reflecting both his personal prestige and the Senate's practical reliance on his capabilities. Archaeological evidence of provincial infrastructure improvements and military installations from his campaigns further illustrates the material and political influence exerted through extraordinary commands. Crassus, by contrast, consolidated power through economic dominance. His wealth, derived from real estate speculation, silver mining, and tax contracts, allowed him to fund political campaigns, maintain private armies, and secure loyalty among clients and urban populations. Contemporary sources note that Crassus' influence extended into the city itself, where his financial leverage shaped voting blocs, supported political allies, and reinforced his authority in assemblies and courts. Together, Crassus and Pompey demonstrated that the combination of personal prestige, wealth, and military success could effectively override established republican procedures, creating an informal hierarchy of power. The rivalry between elite factions further destabilized norms. Although both men were capable of commanding armies and holding consular office, their interactions were guided more by negotiation, alliance, and personal calculation than by codified law. Political maneuvering increasingly relied on mutual accommodation, with each figure seeking to preserve influence while advancing personal and factional objectives. Literary sources indicate that this dynamic contributed to repeated deadlocks in the Senate, where formal processes were subordinated to the imperatives of prestige and personal authority. Extraordinary commands were not limited to the military sphere. The expansion of provincial governance, judicial oversight, and financial control allowed leading figures to accumulate influence over civic administration. Pompey's assignments in reorganizing the eastern provinces and Crassus' management of tax collection contracts exemplify how informal power extended into both domestic and overseas domains. Inscriptions from provincial settlements document appointments and infrastructure projects initiated under their authority, illustrating the blending of personal initiative with public office. This period also witnessed the erosion of procedural safeguards designed to limit individual dominance. While the Senate retained nominal authority to grant or revoke commands, the combination of popular support, military loyalty, and financial resources effectively constrained its ability to enforce limits. Assemblies increasingly ratified extraordinary measures as a practical response to external threats or internal instability, creating a precedent for the prioritization of capability and prestige over institutional norms. Historical commentary highlights that this trend contributed to a perception that formal legal mechanisms were secondary to personal influence in political decision-making. By emphasizing personal achievement and resource control, Pompey and Crassus reshaped the relationship between magistrates, the Senate, and the assemblies. Authority now depended on the capacity to mobilize military, economic, and popular support, rather than strictly on procedural adherence. This reorientation allowed for rapid action and decisive leadership in crises, but it also entrenched factional competition and weakened collective oversight mechanisms. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence of veteran settlements, public buildings, and provincial reorganization under these figures reflects the material consequences of informal power in the late Republic. The practices of Pompey and Crassus set the stage for formal political alliances that bypassed traditional republican mechanisms entirely. Their combined authority, recognized by both the Senate and popular assemblies, demonstrated that the most effective path to power relied on coalition building among elite actors rather than adherence to legal procedure. This dynamic would culminate in the formation of the First Triumvirate, a private alliance consolidating influence and marginalizing institutional checks. Alliance replaced legality. Republican offices became tools of private agreement. By 60 BCE, the concentration of power among Rome's leading figures had reached a point where traditional republican institutions could no longer mediate elite competition effectively. Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, and Marcus Licinius Crassus formed the First Triumvirate, an informal political alliance designed to coordinate their personal ambitions while bypassing constitutional constraints. Contemporary sources, including Plutarch and Suetonius, described the agreement as an unprecedented consolidation of authority, in which personal relationships and strategic advantage substituted for formal legal mechanisms. The alliance allowed each member to leverage the offices and influence of the others to achieve distinct goals. Caesar, seeking the consulship and later a provincial command, relied on the support of Pompey and Crassus to secure electoral victory. Pompey sought ratification of his eastern settlements and veteran allocations, while Crassus pursued financial and administrative influence, including favorable tax arrangements in Asia. Literary evidence emphasizes that these objectives were advanced not through institutional negotiation but through coordinated agreement among the three men, demonstrating the primacy of personal negotiation over republican procedure. The triumvirate's coordination extended to elections, legislation, and administrative appointments. Caesar's consulship in 59 BCE, for example, was facilitated by the combined lobbying and popular support orchestrated by Pompey and Crassus. Legislative initiatives, such as the redistribution of land to Pompey's veterans, were implemented with minimal senatorial resistance due to the pressure exerted by the alliance. Inscriptions and urban records indicate that administrative actions were closely aligned with the priorities of the triumvirate, reflecting a systemic shift in governance whereby republican offices functioned as instruments of private negotiation. Military influence remained central to the triumvirate's power. Pompey's legions, positioned in the east and rewarded through veteran colonies, provided both prestige and coercive capacity. Caesar's own command in Gaul, secured through the consulship and subsequent provincial assignment, created a professional army loyal primarily to him. Crassus, though less directly involved in military operations, supported the alliance through financial resources that underpinned troop payments and public distributions. The combination of wealth, prestige, and military command allowed the triumvirs to manipulate political processes across both the city and the provinces, circumventing traditional checks and balances. The alliance further eroded senatorial authority. While the Senate retained formal power to grant imperium and oversee legislation, the coordinated influence of the triumvirate effectively marginalized opposition. Senators attempting to block measures faced the combined political, financial, and popular pressure of three of Rome's most powerful figures. Literary sources note that opposition was frequently neutralized through negotiation, intimidation, or co-optation, demonstrating that institutional constraints were subordinate to personal networks of influence. The first triumvirate also illustrates the integration of social and economic mechanisms into elite political strategy. Land redistribution, veteran settlements, and control over provincial revenues allowed the triumvirs to consolidate support among both urban populations and military constituencies. Archaeological evidence of colonies, granaries, and civic infrastructure aligns with accounts of coordinated policy implementation, highlighting the material consequences of personal alliances in governance. These measures reinforced loyalty to individual actors rather than to republican institutions, further entrenching the principle that political office could be subordinated to private agreement. By 60 BCE, the republic's balance of power had been fundamentally altered. Authority derived less from constitutional office or legal procedure than from the combined capacity to mobilize wealth, military force, and popular support. The first triumvirate exemplified the shift from collective governance toward oligarchic coordination, demonstrating that personal networks could dominate legislative and electoral processes. The alliance effectively normalized informal arrangements as a primary mechanism for political control, a pattern that would shape subsequent conflicts and the trajectory of late republican politics. Victory abroad destabilized peace at home. Julius Caesar's appointment as governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum in 58 BCE marked the beginning of a decade-long campaign that would dramatically reshape both Rome's military and political landscape. The Gallic Wars, documented in Caesar's own Commentarii de Bello Gallico, demonstrate the consolidation of military power through conquest, wealth accumulation, and personal loyalty, revealing how provincial campaigns could transform an ambitious commander into a decisive political actor. Archaeological evidence from fortified camps, roads, and settlements across Gaul corroborates the scale and logistical sophistication of his campaigns. Caesar's military operations combined strategic innovation with aggressive territorial expansion. He faced both confederated Gallic tribes and Germanic incursions, employing coordinated legions, rapid maneuvering, and systematic fortification of supply lines. Inscriptions and battlefield remains attest to the construction of temporary forts, bridges, and siege works, reflecting both operational discipline and strategic foresight. Caesar's successes created not only wealth through spoils and tribute, but also a professional army whose loyalty was directly tied to him rather than to Rome's central institutions. Soldiers received land grants, payment from plunder, and career advancement, establishing a durable bond of dependence on their general. The accumulation of military prestige amplified Caesar's political influence in Rome. As his conquests became widely known, urban populations and political allies interpreted success in Gaul as a source of authority and legitimacy. Literary sources indicate that Caesar leveraged reports of victory and propaganda to reinforce his position, cultivating loyalty among both the urban plebs and the equestrian order. The intersection of military achievement, wealth acquisition, and popular support illustrates the structural shift in the Republic whereby external conquest could directly translate into domestic political power. Caesar's campaigns also disrupted the existing balance within the First Triumvirate. Crassus's death at Carrhae in 53 BCE removed a key counterweight, and Pompey's political alignment shifted towards senatorial opposition. The personal loyalty of Caesar's legions, combined with the wealth and resources gained in Gaul, positioned him as a singularly dominant figure. Historical accounts emphasize that senators and magistrates were increasingly unable to constrain his actions through legal or procedural means, as his control of armies, provinces, and public support created an operational autonomy unmatched by traditional republican mechanisms. The Gallic Wars further entrenched the principle that military command and success could override institutional norms. Caesar's authority in Gaul allowed him to legislate military discipline, manage territorial governance, and administer resources with minimal interference from the Senate. Inscriptions documenting provincial administration, construction projects, and settlements illustrate the practical application of this authority, demonstrating that provincial control functioned as an extension of personal command rather than collective governance. The social and economic effects of Caesar's campaigns were significant. Spoils of war enriched both the general and his loyal officers, while veterans and allied communities benefited from land allocations and infrastructure development. Archaeological evidence shows a network of roads, bridges, and fortified settlements facilitating both military and administrative control. These measures reinforced loyalty to Caesar personally, rather than to the state, while simultaneously integrating conquered territories into Rome's expanding imperial framework. By 50 BCE, Caesar had accumulated unparalleled military prestige, wealth, and popular support. The combination of these factors created a structural imbalance within the Republic. Traditional mechanisms of political negotiation and constitutional oversight were insufficient to contain the influence of a commander commanding both legions and popular legitimacy. The Senate's attempts to limit Caesar's imperium through legal maneuvers, such as recall orders and restrictions on standing armies, highlighted the inadequacy of conventional checks in the face of concentrated personal power. A river marked the end of restraint. In January 49 BCE, Julius Caesar faced a pivotal choice that would determine the fate of the Roman Republic. After completing his campaigns in Gaul, he was ordered by the Senate, influenced by Pompey and conservative senators, to relinquish his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. This demand, framed as a legal requirement, carried profound political implications. Surrendering command would strip Caesar of imperium, authority over his loyal legions, and personal immunity from prosecution. Historical sources, including Suetonius and Appian, describe the tension surrounding this decision, emphasizing the structural pressures that had accumulated over decades of military reform, elite competition, and institutional erosion. Caesar's response was decisive. In crossing the Rubicon River with the 13th Legion, he violated Roman law forbidding generals from entering Italy proper with armed forces, a legal safeguard designed to protect the city from internal military threat. Contemporary accounts stress the symbolic and constitutional gravity of this act. The Republic's long-standing norms regarding military loyalty, civic obedience, and magistrate authority were irreversibly breached. Archaeological and geographical studies confirm that the Rubicon served as a clear territorial boundary, enforcing a distinction between provincial command and metropolitan authority. By crossing it with troops, Caesar transformed an administrative boundary into a de facto declaration of civil war. The immediate political context reflected systemic fragility. The Senate, increasingly dependent on extraordinary commands, faced a general whose loyalty lay with his legions rather than the state. Pompey and other conservative senators withdrew from Rome, recognizing that conventional civic authority was insufficient to resist Caesar's forces. Literary sources describe a largely unresisted march toward the city, illustrating the incapacity of traditional republican institutions to enforce legal decrees without military backing. This moment demonstrated that personal armies, nurtured through decades of Marian and Caesarian reforms, had supplanted institutional mechanisms of governance. Caesar's crossing also revealed the role of personal loyalty in the late Republic. Soldiers who had served with him in Gaul were bound by consistent training, shared hardship, and tangible reward. Their allegiance was to Caesar directly, rather than to the Senate or city magistrates, enabling the rapid and disciplined execution of military operations within the Italian peninsula. Contemporary records indicate that the 13th Legion and supporting cohorts moved strategically and with minimal resistance, highlighting the operational advantage conferred by a professionalized and personally loyal army. The constitutional collapse triggered by this action was immediate. Magistrates, tribunes, and senatorial assemblies could no longer effectively legislate or enforce policy when confronted by armed opposition under the command of a single general. Legal instruments that had previously constrained imperium were rendered irrelevant, and civil confrontation became the principal mechanism for resolving political disputes. Literary analysis emphasizes that the crossing of the Rubicon symbolized both the failure of republican institutions and the supremacy of personal authority backed by military power. Economic and administrative structures were also affected. Caesar's occupation of northern Italy secured key grain supplies, roads, and urban centers, ensuring both logistical support for his army and leverage over urban populations. Inscriptions and provincial records from this period indicate that control of resources became intertwined with military command, further weakening civic institutions that had traditionally mediated distribution and governance. The integration of economic control and armed force reflected a structural shift in political power, consolidating authority in the hands of an individual rather than collective bodies. By early 49 BCE, the Republic had entered a phase in which negotiation, legal procedure, and civic custom were subordinate to armed authority and personal influence. The crossing of the Rubicon did not merely initiate a civil war. It demonstrated that the Republic's constitutional framework was insufficient to manage the consequences of decades-long military and political evolution. The stage was set for a sequence of campaigns that would dismantle traditional offices, assemblies, and senatorial authority, leading to the permanent restructuring of governance. Victory decided governance, not law. Following the crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE, Julius Caesar moved swiftly to secure Italy, forcing Pompey and much of the Senate to retreat eastward. The confrontation between Caesar and Pompey was not merely a military contest but a decisive struggle over the authority of the Republic itself. With armies loyal to individual commanders rather than the state, traditional legal and procedural mechanisms were effectively sidelined, and the outcome of the civil war would determine governance through force rather than law. Contemporary sources, including Plutarch and Appian, depict a sequence of campaigns across the Italian peninsula, Greece, and the Adriatic as the critical stages in the collapse of republican authority. Caesar pursued Pompey into the Balkan provinces, engaging in a series of strategic maneuvers designed to isolate and confront him decisively. The decisive encounter occurred at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, where Caesar's veteran legions faced Pompey's numerically superior but less cohesive forces. Archaeological evidence and battlefield reconstructions indicate that Caesar employed disciplined formations, tactical reserves, and coordinated cavalry to exploit weaknesses in Pompey's deployment. Literary sources emphasize that Caesar's leadership and the loyalty of his troops were decisive in achieving victory, demonstrating that military competence and personal allegiance now dictated political outcomes. Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus had immediate constitutional consequences. The Senate and other republican institutions, previously capable of mediating political competition, were unable to enforce authority or challenge Caesar's advance. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated, leaving Caesar unopposed by major republican generals and enabling him to consolidate control over both military and civic apparatus. Inscriptions and administrative records from the eastern provinces demonstrate the rapid reorganization of governance under Caesar's authority, highlighting the practical consequences of military supremacy over traditional institutional oversight. The aftermath of Pharsalus illustrates the structural transformation of Roman governance. With his principal rival eliminated, Caesar held imperium across multiple provinces and commanded legions loyal to him personally. Legal and constitutional norms became subordinate to the exercise of personal power, as the Senate's capacity to regulate appointments, commands, or provincial administration was effectively nullified. Contemporary accounts describe Caesar's ability to implement policies, control appointments, and redistribute resources without senatorial consent, emphasizing that military victory had supplanted formal procedure as the determinant of authority. Caesar's consolidation extended beyond military domination. He secured key urban centers, grain supplies, and provincial revenues, ensuring both logistical control and political leverage. Archaeological studies of Roman infrastructure and provincial settlements confirm the practical implementation of these measures, reflecting the integration of administrative, economic, and military authority under a single command. Veteran settlements and land distributions reinforced loyalty, creating a stable support network that further diminished the relevance of republican offices. The Civil War also had social and political ramifications within Rome. Senators, magistrates, and civic administrators were compelled to accommodate Caesar's authority, with legal and procedural constraints subordinated to the realities imposed by military occupation. Public assemblies and courts functioned under supervision or influence of Caesar's loyalists, demonstrating that republican institutions had become instruments of executive enforcement rather than independent centers of governance. Literary sources stress that the traditional mechanisms for political negotiation were permanently weakened, as the ability to mobilize armies became the decisive factor in political outcomes. By the end of 48 BCE, Caesar had effectively neutralized republican opposition, establishing a precedent for governance based on personal authority and military power. The Civil War confirmed that procedural norms, elections, and magistracies could no longer independently constrain a commander with loyal legions. Caesar's victory demonstrated that ultimate authority rested not in legal frameworks, but in the ability to enforce decisions through force, fundamentally altering the republic's political landscape. Stability came at the cost of tradition. Following his decisive victories in the Civil War, Julius Caesar embarked on a program of reforms designed to consolidate authority, stabilize governance, and manage Rome's expanding territories. Between 46 and 44 BCE, he implemented measures that strengthened central control, restructured administrative systems, and extended political participation in select ways. Contemporary sources, including Suetonius and Appian, describe these reforms as both practical solutions to long-standing structural challenges and as unprecedented consolidations of power that bypassed traditional republican mechanisms. A central aspect of Caesar's program was the reorganization of magistracies and provincial administration. He expanded the Senate numerically, incorporating loyal allies and representatives from newly integrated regions, thereby reshaping the composition of the legislative body. Inscriptions and epigraphic evidence document the appointment of senators from Gaul and Spain, reflecting both the practical incorporation of provincial elites and a strategy to ensure legislative compliance. While the Senate retained formal authority, its independence was effectively curtailed, as appointments and policy were closely aligned with Caesar's directives. Administrative control over provinces was similarly centralized. Caesar standardized taxation, regulated grain supply, and reorganized local governance to ensure loyalty to central authority. Military and civil responsibilities were increasingly coordinated under his oversight, reducing the autonomy of governors and magistrates. Archaeological records of roads, granaries, and urban infrastructure demonstrate the scale and durability of these reforms, which facilitated both economic integration and political control across Rome's territories. These measures strengthened stability but diminished the institutional checks that had traditionally constrained consular and senatorial authority. Social and economic policies also reinforced Caesar's centralization of power. Grain distributions, veteran settlements, and public works projects linked popular support and military loyalty directly to the administration of a single individual. Literary accounts indicate that these programs alleviated urban distress while creating networks of dependence that strengthened personal authority over traditional republican mechanisms. The allocation of public resources through executive control underscored the shift from collective deliberation to centralized governance. Despite the practical benefits of these reforms, opposition remained entrenched among conservative senators and elite factions. Many viewed Caesar's accumulation of powers, his lifelong dictatorship, tribunician authority, and control of legislative processes, as a direct threat to republican norms. Historical accounts indicate repeated attempts to obstruct policies, challenge appointments, and resist centralized initiatives, though these efforts were increasingly ineffective against the combination of military backing, administrative control, and popular support. Caesar's reforms institutionalized a tension between efficiency and legality, demonstrating that structural stability had been achieved at the expense of traditional procedures. Caesar's centralization also set the stage for political polarization and lethal opposition. By concentrating authority in a single individual, he removed mechanisms that had historically mediated elite competition and institutionalized negotiation. Senators who opposed him were marginalized, while those aligned with him gained enhanced influence, creating an environment in which political dissent could no longer be expressed through conventional channels alone. Literary sources describe rising discontent, clandestine plotting, and factional coordination among elites determined to preserve the Republic's traditional framework. By 44 BCE, Caesar's reforms had effectively transformed the Republic into a centralized system dependent on his personal authority. The Senate and magistracies remained operative in form, but their capacity to act independently was severely constrained. Administrative efficiency and stability were achieved, yet the accumulation of power in one figure created structural incentives for violent resistance. The mechanisms that had preserved the Republic, collective office holding, term limits, and constitutional checks, had been circumvented or rendered ineffective by military control, popular allegiance, and executive oversight. Opposition turned lethal. The Republic was invoked with daggers. On March 15, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the theater of Pompey, marking a dramatic attempt to restore republican governance. Historical sources, including Suetonius, Plutarch, and Appian, detail the coordination of the conspiracy, involving over 60 senators and equestrians who viewed Caesar's accumulation of power as a direct threat to the Republic. The conspirators framed their actions as a defense of tradition, invoking the Senate and citizen assemblies as moral and political justification for eliminating a dictator whose authority had eclipsed constitutional norms. The motivations behind the assassination were multifaceted. Political elites opposed to Caesar's centralization feared the permanent erosion of senatorial authority. Long-standing rivalries, personal grievances, and concerns about precedent for military-backed authority converged with ideological resistance to concentrated executive power. Literary accounts emphasize that many conspirators saw themselves as acting to protect the collective institutions of the Republic, even as their personal ambitions intertwined with broader ideological claims. Archaeological evidence from the Forum and surrounding urban infrastructure indicates that the site of the assassination was carefully selected to ensure both visibility and symbolic resonance within Rome's civic landscape. The act itself demonstrated the limits of legal and institutional remedies in the late Republic. The conspirators bypassed assemblies, courts, and procedural norms, relying instead on violence to achieve political aims. Contemporary sources describe the chaotic scene. Caesar was attacked by multiple assailants, sustaining 23 stab wounds before succumbing. This method of political resolution underscored the systemic reality that authority in the late Republic had become inseparable from coercion, and that military and personal power had overshadowed formal civic mechanisms. Despite the symbolic invocation of republican restoration, the assassination failed to re-establish institutional stability. Caesar's death created an immediate power vacuum in both the executive and military spheres. His legions, loyal to their commander and invested in his legacy, remained intact and organized under subordinate officers such as Mark Antony and later Octavian. Inscriptions and military records from this period indicate that troops retained cohesion and operational capability, preventing the conspirators from converting the act into effective political control. The assassination also revealed the structural fragility of the Republic. Without a clear succession mechanism or centralized authority, competing factions scrambled to assert influence. Senators sought to reassert traditional prerogatives, while Caesar's allies and supporters leveraged military loyalty to secure political and territorial advantage. The intersection of personal armies, popular support, and institutional ambiguity created conditions for renewed civil conflict, highlighting that the elimination of a single individual, however powerful, could not restore systemic balance. Social and administrative consequences were immediate. Caesar's policies, including land distributions, veteran settlements, and centralized provincial governance, remained in effect, reinforcing the dependence of various constituencies on executive authority. Popular support for Caesar persisted among urban populations, veterans, and provincial elites, undermining the conspirators' claims of defending the Republic. Archaeological evidence of urban protests, public gatherings, and commemorative inscriptions demonstrates that the public perception of legitimacy remained closely tied to Caesar's legacy rather than to the conspirators' actions. By the end of the Ides of March, the assassination had achieved a symbolic assertion of republican ideals but failed to reinstate collective governance. The conspirators' reliance on violence over institutions exposed the vulnerability of the Republic's structures to military and personal authority. The immediate aftermath highlighted the disconnect between legal or ideological claims and practical enforcement, emphasizing that structural balance required more than the removal of an individual. Public sentiment favored order over ideology. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BCE plunged Rome into immediate political and social turmoil. Far from restoring republican governance, the act triggered widespread uncertainty, public unrest, and competing claims to authority. Contemporary accounts, including those of Suetonius, Appian, and Plutarch, detail the volatile atmosphere in the city. Citizens, veterans, and provincial representatives reacted with shock, confusion, and, in many cases, open hostility toward the conspirators. The structural imbalance of the late Republic meant that authority was no longer abstract or collective. It was inseparable from military power, popular support, and control of resources. A defining moment in public reaction was Mark Antony's funerary oration for Caesar. Delivered before a large assembly in the Forum, Antony's speech leveraged Caesar's achievements and personal charisma to incite popular sentiment against the conspirators. He displayed Caesar's bloodied toga and invoked the benefits Caesar had provided to the populace, including grain distributions and veteran settlements. Literary sources emphasize Antony's rhetorical strategy. By framing Caesar's death as an affront to civic stability and material security, he shifted public outrage from abstract republican ideals to immediate support for order and leadership. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and urban records, indicates that the Forum and surrounding areas became sites of mass gatherings, signaling organized popular mobilization. Rioting erupted in response to Antony's oration. Citizens and veterans attacked conspirators' properties, looted estates, and engaged in violent confrontations with senatorial supporters. Urban unrest demonstrated that the public prioritized tangible benefits, security, provisions, and administrative continuity over ideological loyalty to the notion of a restored republic. Contemporary accounts describe barricades, street confrontations, and spontaneous assemblies, reflecting the intensity of popular engagement and the incapacity of traditional magistracies to enforce civic order. The conspirators themselves faced immediate structural limitations. Lacking control of the military and relying primarily on symbolic legitimacy, they were unable to exert authority over urban populations or provincial governance. Attempts to legitimize their actions through Senate decrees failed to persuade the citizenry, whose loyalty was closely tied to Caesar's legacy and the tangible outcomes of his policies. Inscriptions and letters from this period document the fracturing of official communication channels and the localized assertion of authority by urban and provincial actors, highlighting the decentralized nature of power in the late Republic. Amid the unrest, regional elites and military commanders emerged as critical arbiters of stability. Legions stationed in Cisalpine Gaul, southern Italy, and the provinces remained loyal to Caesar's memory, under officers such as Mark Antony and Gaius Octavian. These forces could mobilize quickly, suppress riots, and assert control over key infrastructure, illustrating the structural reality that military backing had become the primary determinant of political authority. Literary sources describe the mobilization of troops and the negotiation of loyalty among provincial governors, emphasizing that control of armed forces now overshadowed senatorial or civic prerogatives. Public sentiment and social dynamics also shaped political calculation. The urban populace, invested in Caesar's grain distributions and public works, resisted the conspirators' ideological appeals. Veterans, who had received land and benefits under Caesar's administration, aligned with his supporters to protect their interests. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence of veteran settlements, distributions, and public monuments underscores the material foundations of this loyalty, demonstrating that governance depended as much on maintaining established benefits as on legal or procedural legitimacy. By mid-44 BCE, the city remained in a state of precarious equilibrium. Riots, popular assemblies, and displays of military loyalty highlighted the inability of the conspirators to restore authority through traditional channels. The Senate retained nominal power, but enforcement relied increasingly on negotiation, factional alignment, and coercive potential. This environment of uncertainty created the conditions for the emergence of new contenders for power, as ambitious individuals recognized the opportunity to leverage both military command and popular support to dominate the political landscape and reshaped legitimacy. In the chaotic months following Julius Caesar's assassination, Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian, emerged as a pivotal figure in the contest for authority. Though only 18 years old at the time, Octavian's position as Caesar's adopted son and legal heir provided him with a unique claim to legitimacy under Roman law. Contemporary sources, including Appian, Suetonius, and Dio, emphasize that Octavian's rise combined strategic legal positioning, calculated alliances, and the ability to leverage both popular and military loyalty, illustrating how personal lineage could become a structural mechanism for political authority in the late Republic. Octavian's initial advantage was his formal adoption by Caesar, which established him as Caesar Divi Filius, son of the deified Caesar, and created a legal basis to claim political inheritance. This status allowed him to present himself as the rightful continuator of Caesar's policies, consolidating support among veterans, urban populations, and provincial officials who had benefited from Caesar's reforms. Inscriptions and coinage from this period reinforce his adoption as a central claim, depicting Octavian with symbols associating him with Caesar's memory and authority. These materials demonstrate that legal and symbolic legitimacy could be leveraged as a tool of practical power. Recognizing the limitations of his personal resources, Octavian quickly formed strategic alliances. He aligned with Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, to secure military support and credibility among experienced commanders. Contemporary accounts detail the negotiation of cooperative arrangements, in which Octavian maintained nominal deference while exercising independent initiative. These alliances allowed him to consolidate control over Caesar's legions stationed in Italy and the provinces, effectively transforming inherited prestige into operational authority. The combination of legal legitimacy and military backing positioned Octavian as a central actor in the ongoing struggle for control. Octavian also engaged the urban populace through public displays and political maneuvering. He organized assemblies to confirm his inheritance, distributed benefits associated with Caesar's legacy, and maintained the loyalty of veteran cohorts through land grants and other material rewards. Literary sources indicate that these measures reinforced his personal authority while simultaneously undermining rival factions, demonstrating that effective governance in this period required both legal recognition and practical enforcement through patronage and military support. Archaeological evidence, including records of veteran settlements and urban infrastructure projects, confirms the tangible impact of these initiatives. The formation of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE formalized Octavian's political position. Alongside Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Octavian gained extraordinary powers sanctioned by the Lex Titia, granting the trio authority to prosecute enemies, administer provinces, and manage military operations without standard senatorial oversight. This legal framework provided a veneer of constitutional legitimacy to what was effectively a concentration of power in 3 individuals, demonstrating the continuing evolution of republican offices into instruments of coalition-based authority. Inscriptions, coins, and public decrees from this period document the official recognition of these powers and the alignment of administrative structures under triumviral control. Octavian's rise exemplifies the structural interplay between legal claims, personal alliances, and military backing in late Republican politics. His ability to transform a nominal inheritance into practical authority highlights the dependence of political legitimacy on a combination of law, public perception, and coercive capacity. This period also illustrates the persistence of traditional Republican mechanisms. Assemblies, magistracies, and legal instruments remained operative in form, even as substantive power shifted to figures able to command loyalty and enforce decisions. By the end of 43 BCE, Octavian had secured a stable position within Rome's fractured political hierarchy. Through adoption, alliance, and strategic deployment of resources, he transformed a legal claim into actionable authority. His rise demonstrated that the combination of legitimacy, military loyalty, and elite cooperation had become the decisive determinant of political control. The mechanisms of the late Republic continued to exist, but their efficacy now depended on personal alignment with powerful actors rather than independent operation. Extraordinary power became law. In 43 BCE, the political landscape of Rome underwent a fundamental transformation with the establishment of the Second Triumvirate, formalized by the Lex Titia. Composed of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the triumvirs were granted extraordinary legal authority to reorganize governance, prosecute enemies, and control both military and civil administration for a term of 5 years. Contemporary sources, including Appian and Cassius Dio, emphasized that this legal empowerment marked a departure from republican norms, effectively institutionalizing autocracy within the framework of Roman law. The Senate, assemblies, and magistracies retained formal existence, but substantive authority now resided in the triumvirs, whose decisions were enforceable without conventional oversight. One of the earliest and most consequential measures of the Second Triumvirate was the initiation of proscriptions. Public lists identified political opponents and property owners deemed hostile to the regime, allowing their execution and confiscation of assets. Literary accounts note that these lists were extensive and systematically enforced, targeting senators, equestrians, and other elites who resisted or threatened triumviral authority. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and confiscation records, documents the material impact of proscriptions. Estates were redistributed to veterans, public funds were replenished, and loyal supporters were rewarded. These actions reinforced both the military and political dominance of the triumvirs while establishing a structural precedent for legally sanctioned extrajudicial authority. The consolidation of power extended beyond punitive measures. The triumvirs reorganized provincial governance, distributing commands and territories to ensure loyalty and strategic control. Antony dominated the eastern provinces and command over key legions. Lepidus retained Africa and certain western territories, and Octavian exercised influence over Italy and strategic urban centers. Military force, coordinated through this territorial division, became the primary instrument for implementing policy and maintaining order. Literary and epigraphic evidence highlights that this division of authority allowed the triumvirs to project control efficiently, reducing the operational role of traditional republican offices in both legislative and administrative functions. Financial and social mechanisms were similarly integrated into triumviral governance. Confiscated wealth funded army pay, veteran settlements, and public programs, reinforcing loyalty to the triumvirs rather than to civic institutions. Inscriptions and coinage from the period reflect both the redistribution of property and the symbolic messaging of authority, emphasizing allegiance to the triumvirate and the legal codification of their extraordinary powers. This combination of legal sanction, military enforcement, and economic control established a durable framework for autocratic governance within the nominal structures of the Republic. The establishment of the Second Triumvirate also reinforced factional alignment as a central feature of political stability. By formally concentrating authority, the triumvirs reduced the role of negotiation among senators, assemblies, and magistrates in determining outcomes. Opposition was either neutralized through proscriptions, co-opted through appointments, or rendered irrelevant by the combination of military control and legal sanction. Contemporary sources emphasize that the legal framework of the triumvirate legitimized previously extralegal methods, demonstrating how law could codify extraordinary authority in response to systemic instability. While the triumvirate achieved immediate consolidation, it also intensified civil conflict. Political opponents, regional powers, and disenfranchised factions resisted the concentration of authority, leading to renewed military campaigns across Italy, the eastern provinces, and the western territories. Archaeological evidence of fortified settlements, legionary camps, and battle sites confirms the scale and intensity of these operations. The formalization of autocracy did not eliminate armed resistance. Rather, it provided the legal and institutional tools to mobilize resources against challengers more efficiently than traditional republican mechanisms could have. By institutionalizing extraordinary authority, the Second Triumvirate demonstrated that law could be employed to legitimize personal and collective power, overriding traditional republican checks. Magistracies, elections, and senatorial oversight remained in place as formal mechanisms, but they were subordinate to the legal and operational capacity of the triumvirs. The combination of military control, economic redistribution, and legal sanction exemplifies the systemic shift from collective republican governance to a framework dominated by a small number of coordinated actors. Republican armies fell to imperial reality. The final organized opposition to the Second Triumvirate coalesced under Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, the leading conspirators of Julius Caesar's assassination. By 42 BCE, these republican forces had assembled legions in the eastern provinces, particularly Macedonia, with the goal of challenging the consolidated authority of Octavian and Mark Antony. Contemporary sources, including Appian and Plutarch, highlight that the confrontation at Philippi represented the culmination of the late Republic's systemic collapse. Traditional civic governance had failed to restrain military power, and the decisive determinant of political authority was now armed force. The campaign at Philippi consisted of two major engagements. In the first battle, Brutus confronted Octavian's legions while Cassius faced Antony's forces. Despite numerical parity, Antony and Octavian applied superior coordination, tactical reserves, and disciplined legion formations. Archaeological surveys of the Macedonian battlefield indicate entrenchments, fortified camps, and strategic deployments consistent with detailed historical accounts, confirming the sophistication of triumviral operations. Cassius, misjudging the tactical situation, committed suicide after believing his forces had been defeated, while Brutus maintained control of his legions temporarily, prolonging the confrontation. The second engagement decisively concluded Republican resistance. Brutus's legions, though disciplined, were exhausted and outmaneuvered by the combined forces of Octavian and Antony. Following repeated assaults and encirclement, Brutus also committed suicide, effectively eliminating the central leadership of the senatorial opposition. Contemporary accounts emphasize the structural implications. With the deaths of Brutus and Cassius, the remaining Republican factions were left without centralized coordination, undermining both military and political capacity to resist the triumvirs. The outcomes at Philippi confirmed the supremacy of personal command over constitutional authority. Republican ideals, assemblies, and senatorial decrees no longer functioned as mechanisms to mobilize or coordinate effective political action. The legion's loyalty to commanders, rather than to the republic, determined the resolution of conflict. Inscriptions and military records from the eastern provinces show that victorious forces were systematically rewarded with land allocations, spoils, and command positions, consolidating support and reinforcing the new operational hierarchy of power. Economic and administrative consolidation followed the military victory. Antony and Octavian divided control over provinces and resources, integrating territorial administration with military oversight. Urban centers, roads, and granaries were secured, ensuring both the enforcement of authority and the stabilization of logistical supply lines. Archaeological evidence confirms the reconstruction of strategic infrastructure and the establishment of veteran settlements, highlighting the material basis of triumviral consolidation. These measures demonstrated that political authority in the late Republic was inseparable from operational control over both resources and armed forces. The social consequences of Philippi were similarly significant. Urban populations and provincial elites, previously reliant on republican institutions, shifted allegiance to the triumvirs for security and continuity. The elimination of prominent republican leaders disrupted networks of patronage and civic negotiation, compelling civic actors to integrate within the new power structure. Literary sources describe the systematic absorption of former opposition allies into administrative or military roles under the triumvirs, illustrating the structural co-option that reinforced centralized authority. By the end of 42 BCE, the Republic's last organized military resistance had been extinguished. The structural hierarchy of governance had shifted entirely. Authority was concentrated in the triumviral coalition, exercised through personal loyalty, military control, and legal sanction. Traditional Republican offices remained nominally operative but lacked substantive capacity, and the mechanisms that had once mediated political competition, term limits, collegial magistracies, and senatorial oversight, were subordinated to the realities of enforced compliance and coordinated command. Civil war was reframed as foreign threat. By 32 BCE, the Roman political landscape was dominated by the rivalry between Octavian and Mark Antony, whose alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt complicated the struggle for ultimate authority. Following the formal end of the Second Triumvirate, tensions escalated as Octavian portrayed Antony not merely as a political rival but as a threat allied with a foreign monarch. Contemporary sources, including Plutarch, Dio, and Cassius Dio, emphasized that propaganda and legal declarations were critical in framing the conflict. Octavian leveraged Antony's association with Cleopatra to mobilize public sentiment, legislative support, and military loyalty, transforming civil war into a campaign of national and ideological significance. Octavian's political strategy was methodical. The Senate, influenced by Octavian's narratives, declared war on Cleopatra rather than Antony, framing the confrontation as a defense of Roman sovereignty against foreign domination. Literary accounts describe the circulation of pamphlets, public speeches, and coinage depicting Cleopatra as a foreign queen exerting undue influence over Antony, emphasizing moral and civic arguments for Octavian's leadership. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and coinage, confirms the systematic use of propaganda to consolidate domestic support and legitimize military action against Antony's forces. Military preparations for the conflict reflected careful coordination and strategic planning. Octavian commanded legions stationed in Italy and the western provinces, while Antony and Cleopatra consolidated forces in the eastern Mediterranean. Naval and land operations were synchronized to maximize tactical advantage, including control of key ports and logistical supply lines. Archaeological surveys of the Ionian coast, harbor remains, and shipwrecks corroborate accounts of large-scale naval engagement, indicating both the scale and complexity of the conflict. This operational preparation demonstrated that the outcome would be determined by disciplined military coordination rather than procedural or legal negotiation. The decisive confrontation occurred at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, employed superior maneuverability, strategic positioning, and sustained blockades to neutralize Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces. Contemporary accounts describe the defection of key captains, loss of naval cohesion, and the retreat of Antony and Cleopatra to Egypt, effectively ending organized opposition. The structural significance of Actium lies in the centralization of military and political authority. Octavian's victory demonstrated that ultimate control required both operational command and effective strategic planning, rather than reliance on republican institutions. Following Actium, Octavian consolidated control over the eastern Mediterranean, reorganizing provinces, military garrisons, and administrative offices. Inscriptions, coins, and provincial records attest to the systematic absorption of territories formerly aligned with Antony and Cleopatra, ensuring both loyalty and logistical efficiency. Economic, social, and military integration reinforced centralized authority, linking governance directly to Octavian's personal command and strategic oversight. Traditional offices, magistracies, and assemblies remained nominally operative, but their functional independence was effectively subordinate to the authority exercised through military and administrative consolidation. The conflict also solidified Octavian's manipulation of legitimacy. By framing the war as a defense against foreign influence, he justified extraordinary powers and the concentration of authority in his own hands. Popular support, veteran loyalty, and senatorial acquiescence were secured not only through military success but also through the perception of civic necessity and legal sanction. Literary sources emphasize that this combination of propaganda, operational control, and institutional alignment created a structural model for the Principate. Authority derived from both personal capability and legitimizing narratives, rather than purely from republican offices. By the conclusion of the Actium campaign in 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, and Octavian had established uncontested control over Rome's military, political, and economic structures. The civil wars that had destabilized the late Republic were resolved through a combination of military dominance and strategic legitimacy, demonstrating that personal authority and operational capacity had supplanted traditional republican mechanisms. The consolidation of power set the stage for the formal establishment of a new governing framework in Rome. Military resolution followed. A single battle ended centuries of tradition. The Battle of Actium, fought on September 2, 31 BCE, marked the decisive turning point in the final civil war of the Roman Republic. Octavian's forces, under the strategic command of his admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, confronted the combined fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the Ionian Sea near the promontory of Actium. Contemporary accounts, including those of Plutarch, Appian, and Dio, highlight the battle's scale, tactical complexity, and political consequences. The engagement would determine not only the outcome of the war, but also the future structure of Roman governance. Octavian's tactical preparation was meticulous. Agrippa had established a blockade, controlling the southern and western approaches to the Gulf of Ambracia, while Octavian's fleet was organized into disciplined squadrons capable of coordinated maneuvers. Antony's larger but less cohesive forces, including Egyptian vessels and allied contingents, suffered from logistical fragmentation and varying degrees of loyalty. Archaeological surveys of shipwreck sites and harbor remains corroborate contemporary descriptions of the fleet sizes, formations, and deployment strategies, confirming that naval discipline and maneuverability were decisive factors in the outcome. The battle unfolded over several hours, with Octavian's forces maintaining cohesion, while Antony's lines became increasingly disorganized. Sources report that Antony's heavier vessels, although numerically superior, were less maneuverable, allowing Agrippa to execute flanking movements and disrupt supply and communication lines. Defections among allied captains further weakened Antony's position, illustrating the role of personal loyalty and coordination in determining military success. The tactical superiority of Octavian's fleet, combined with disciplined execution, neutralized the numerical advantage of Antony's forces. Cleopatra's presence added both operational and symbolic complexity. Her fleet initially supported Antony's central line but ultimately withdrew during the engagement, precipitating the collapse of morale among Antony's remaining vessels. Contemporary accounts note that Antony followed Cleopatra in retreat, leaving his forces leaderless and disorganized. Archaeological studies of Mediterranean shipwrecks and coastal fortifications indicate that both fleets had fortified supply points and staging areas, but Octavian's control of these locations amplified the structural advantage of his operational planning. The outcome of Actium had immediate political and administrative consequences. With Antony and Cleopatra fleeing to Egypt, Octavian secured control over the eastern provinces, including Egypt's strategic grain supply. Military command, territorial administration, and economic resources were consolidated under a single authority, demonstrating that decisive political power now required both operational control and strategic oversight. The traditional republican mechanisms for negotiating power, assemblies, magistracies, and senatorial decrees, were effectively subordinated to military outcomes. The battle also reinforced the structural integration of legitimacy, military authority, and governance. Octavian's victory allowed him to present himself as the defender of Rome and the Republic, despite the formal elimination of traditional checks and balances. Propaganda, coinage, and inscriptions emphasized the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra as a civic and national necessity, linking personal authority to perceived legal and moral justification. Literary sources emphasize that Octavian's consolidation of power after Actium relied not only on operational success, but also on the perception of legitimacy, combining military and institutional strategies. Social and economic stabilization followed rapidly. Veterans from Octavian's legions were settled in colonies, former enemy territories were reorganized under loyal administrators, and urban centers previously aligned with Antony were integrated into the emerging centralized structure. Archaeological evidence confirms the implementation of veteran settlements, infrastructural improvements, and administrative reorganization, highlighting the material foundations of power consolidation. The battle's result allowed Octavian to convert military success into sustainable governance. By the end of 31 BCE, the Roman Republic's final military resistance had been decisively defeated. Actium demonstrated that centuries of procedural and institutional tradition could be superseded by the combination of military strategy, personal command, and legitimizing narrative. The battle concluded the civil wars and provided the structural conditions for a new form of governance, in which authority derived from both personal capability and legal sanction. Success overwhelmed tradition. The fall of the Roman Republic was rooted in systemic tensions between political institutions designed for a city-state and the realities of a rapidly expanding empire. By the 1st century BCE, Rome controlled territories spanning the Italian peninsula, the Western Mediterranean, and parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. Republican offices, assemblies, and senatorial authority, originally structured for local governance, were ill-suited to manage such extensive domains. Contemporary sources, including Polybius, Cicero, and Sallust, highlight the growing mismatch between procedural norms and operational demands, illustrating that institutional rigidity created vulnerabilities that ambitious leaders could exploit. A primary structural strain arose from the delegation of military command. Consuls and proconsuls, elected annually, were responsible for provincial armies and campaigns far from Rome. The physical distance, combined with the increasing reliance on personal loyalty of troops, allowed commanders to act with autonomy that often conflicted with senatorial directives. Archaeological evidence of legionary bases, roads, and supply depots demonstrates the scale of Rome's military infrastructure, which required centralized operational oversight beyond what annual magistracies could provide. This separation of authority facilitated the rise of personal armies and undermined collective control, setting the stage for repeated civil conflict. The Senate and assemblies themselves faced structural limitations. Republican procedures, including collegial magistracies, term limits, and legislative debate, were effective for the city-state but insufficient for managing imperial-scale resources, provinces, and trade networks. Wealth from overseas conquest, including spoils, tribute, and land, concentrated in the hands of elites with provincial commands, intensifying economic inequality and creating competing centers of influence. Literary sources, such as Polybius and Livy, note that this accumulation of wealth and influence eroded the effectiveness of collective governance, as personal alliances increasingly determined political outcomes. Social and economic pressures further amplified structural stress. Land redistribution lagged behind demographic shifts, with citizen farmers displaced by latifundia and reliance on slave labor. Urbanization created concentrations of population dependent on grain doles and public infrastructure. The inability of republican institutions to coordinate economic policy across provinces, manage distribution, and enforce local administration exposed governance gaps that ambitious leaders could exploit. Archaeological evidence, including urban settlements, farm estates, and grain storage facilities, confirms the growing disparity between centralized authority and social realities. Administrative control over provinces was similarly strained. Governors wielded substantial autonomy, with legions and local revenues at their disposal. While the Senate retained nominal oversight, its capacity to enforce regulations was constrained by distance, communication limitations, and the political power of provincial commanders. Legal texts, inscriptions, and contemporary speeches demonstrate that commanders often pursued personal or factional interests, undermining republican norms. The structural tension between central authority and provincial autonomy created recurring opportunities for civil war, as ambitious generals leveraged local power bases to contest authority in Rome itself. Additionally, the codified republican framework lacked mechanisms to integrate the increasingly complex social, military, and economic systems of an empire. Assemblies, tribunes, and magistracies could not effectively arbitrate between competing elites or resolve disputes over wealth, command, or succession. This institutional mismatch rendered collective governance increasingly fragile, dependent on consensus among elites whose loyalty was fragmented and conditional. The concentration of resources and influence in individual hands, coupled with procedural rigidity, created structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited through personal ambition and force. By mid-1st century BCE, the Republic's success, the accumulation of territory, wealth, and military capability, had created conditions incompatible with its traditional governance structures. Republican institutions were simultaneously overextended and undermined, producing recurring crises of authority, competition among elites, and reliance on extraordinary measures to enforce control. The The system's inherent limitations meant that structural imbalance, rather than isolated events or individual malfeasance, set the stage for political collapse. Before we continue with the next chapter, make sure to hit subscribe, click the bell icon to get the daily Nightfall history video, and leave a comment sharing which part of the Roman Republic's fall surprised you the most. Your engagement helps us bring more in-depth, cinematic history directly to you.